Have you ever come across a sentence in your writing or that of others that seems almost intent on losing you, the reader, before it finishes? You hang on to that sentence one word after the next, but by the time you have reached the period, you realize that you did not understand anything the author tried to say. Don't know what I mean? Try this one. In view of claims by researchers on higher education indicating at least one change by most undergraduate students of their major field of study, first-year students may need better guidance when they choose a major. Much like a bucking horse, a sentence like this is likely to knock you out of your saddle, leave you behind in the dust, and it may even hurt as much. Hi, my name is Volker Janssen from the Department of History. In this video, I want to share some tips on how to tame those unwieldy sentences. After all, you want your readers to enjoy your writing and want to turn the page for more, not suffer and endure your work. There is more to good writing than good sentences, of course, and there is more to good history than knowing how to write. But if your sentences don't work, the rest of your work goes down with it. This video builds on a previous video on sentence building blocks. Make sure to check it out if the terminology used here confuses you. Let's get started. Awkward sentences have many different origins. Sometimes you are writing about an unfamiliar and complex topic for intimidating readers. You employ words you are not sure you understand, or you describe concepts you are a bit hazy on yourself. In those times, we may hope that a complex-looking sentence will give your reader the impression that we are also complex thinkers. Maybe we're lucky and they will give us credit but blame themselves for not understanding us. At other times, we may find our own writing perfectly clear when our readers clearly don't. You need a way to revise sentences in both of these situations. To revise those you know need help, and even more, to identify and improve those that you think are fine, but that readers might not. Let's look at an example of sentences in which the writer wanted to sound like a serious scholar, but ended up sounding merely pretentious. A better understanding of student learning could achieve improvement in teaching effectiveness. However impressive that sounds, the student who wrote it meant only this: if we better understood how students learn, we could teach them more effectively. To diagnose that sentence and revise it, you must know a few grammatical terms: noun, verb, active verb, passive verb, whole subject, simple subject, main clause, and a subordinate clause. If these terms are unfamiliar, go back to the video on sentence building blocks. Here are some key rules for improving sentences. There is an overarching principle to improving sentences, and that is focus on the first 7 or 8 words. Just as the key to a clearly written paper, section, or paragraph is in its first few sentences, so the key to a clearly written sentence is in its first few words. When readers grasp those first 7 or 8 words easily, they read what follows faster, understand it better, and remember it longer. It is the difference between these two sentences. The United Nations' insistence on acceptance by all nations of the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples is a product of its recognition that maintenance of stability in the world order requires that nations be guided by values beyond narrow self-interest. Or how about this instead? The United Nations insists that all nations accept the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples because it recognizes that maintaining a stable world order requires that nations be guided by values beyond narrow self-interest. So, how do we make the first 7 or 8 words clear and the remainder of the sentence inviting? There are 6 things you can do. Get to the subject of your sentence quickly. Begin sentences with long phrases and clauses only occasionally. Make subjects short and concrete, ideally naming the character that performs the action expressed by the verb that follows. Avoid separating the subject and verb with more than a word or two. Put key actions in verbs, not in nouns. Put information familiar to readers at the beginning of a sentence, new information at the end. Choose an active or passive verb based on which lets you best apply the preceding principles. And use first-person pronouns appropriately. Those principles are not inviolable rules, but guidelines you can rely on to communicate clearly with your readers. They add up to this. Readers want to get past a short, concrete, familiar subject quickly and to a verb expressing a specific action. When a sentence lets them do that, the rest of the sentence will usually take care of itself. To diagnose your own writing, skim the first 7 or 8 words of every sentence. Look for sentences in which you don't follow our 7 principles, and then revise them. Let's look at this in more detail. So first, get to the subject of your sentence quickly. Compare these 2 sentences. Introductory phrases are bold-faced, whole subjects italicized. In view of claims by researchers on higher education indicating at least one change by most undergraduate students of their major field of study, first-year students may need better guidance when they choose a major. Or, researchers on higher education claim that most students change their major field of study at least once during their undergraduate career. If that is so, then first-year students may need better guidance when they choose a major. Most readers find the first version harder to read than the second, because it makes them work through a 24-word phrase before they reach its subject, first-year students. In the revision, readers immediately start with the subject, researchers on higher education, or reach it after a very short clause, if that is so. The principle is this. Start most of your sentences directly with their whole subjects. Begin only a few sentences with introductory phrases or clauses longer than 10 or so words. You can usually revise long introductory phrases and subordinate clauses into separate independent sentences, as in this example. Next, make subjects short and concrete. Readers must grasp the subject of a sentence easily, but they can't when the subject is long, complex, and abstract. Compare these 2 sentences. A school system's successful adoption of a new reading curriculum for its elementary schools depends on the demonstration in each school of the commitment of its principal and the cooperation of teachers in setting reasonable goals. Or, the school system will adopt a new reading curriculum for elementary schools successfully only when principals demonstrate that they are committed to it and teachers cooperate to set reasonable goals. In the original, the whole subject is 14 words long, and its simple subject is an abstraction adoption. In the revision, the clearer version, the whole subject of every verb is short, and each simple subject is relatively concrete. School system, principals, they, teachers. Moreover, each of those subjects performs the action in its verb. Systems will adopt, principal demonstrates, they are committed, teachers cooperate. The principle is this. Readers generally find a sentence readable when the subject of its verb names the main character in a few concrete words, ideally a character that is also the doer of the action expressed by the verb that follows. But there's a complication. I'm not saying that to be clear, you must write only about people and concrete things. In fact, writers often tell clear stories about abstract characters. Look at this example. No skill is more valued in the professional world than problem solving. The ability to solve problems quickly requires us to frame situations in different ways and to find more than one solution. In fact, effective problem solving may define general intelligence. Few readers have trouble with those abstract subjects because they're short and familiar. No skill, the ability to solve problems quickly, and effective problem solving. What gives readers trouble is an abstract subject that is long and unfamiliar. To fix sentences with long abstract subjects, revise in 3 steps. First, you identify the main character in the sentence. Then, you find its key action, and if that is buried in an abstract noun, make it a verb. Make the main character the subject of that new verb. For example, compare this sentence with its revision. Without a means for analyzing interactions between social class and education in regard to the creation of job opportunities, success in understanding economic mobility will remain limited. By contrast, economists do not entirely understand economic mobility because they cannot analyze how social class and education interact to create job opportunities. In both sentences, the main character is economists, but in the original, that character isn't the subject of any verb. In fact, it's not in the sentence at all. We must infer it from actions buried in nouns like analyzing and understanding. That's what economists do, hopefully. We revise the original by making the main characters economists, social class, and education. They are the subjects of the explicit verbs understand, analyze, interact, and create. Next, you avoid separating subject and verb with more than a word or two. Once past the short subject, readers want to get to a verb quickly, so avoid splitting a verb from its subject with long phrases and clauses. Some economists, because they write in a style that is impersonal and objective, do not communicate with lay people easily. In this original, the because clause separates the subject, some economists, from the verb do not communicate, forcing us to mentally suspend our breath. To revise, move the interrupting clause to the beginning or end of its sentence, depending on whether it connects more closely to the sentence before or the one after. When in doubt, put it at the end. Because some economists write in a style that is impersonal and objective, they do not communicate with lay people easily. This inability to communicate, yada, yada, yada. Or you could say, some economists do not communicate with lay people easily because they write in a style that is impersonal and objective. They use passive verbs and you go on from there. Readers manage short interruptions more easily, as in this example. Few economists deliberately write in a style that is impersonal and objective. Next, put key actions in verbs, not nouns. Readers want to get to a verb quickly, but they also want that verb to express a key action. So avoid using an empty verb such as have, do, make, or be to introduce an action buried in an abstract noun. Make the noun a verb. Compare these two sentences. During the early years of the First World War, the great powers' attempt at enlisting the United States on their side was met with failure. Here's the revision. During the early years of the First World War, the great powers attempted to enlist the United States on their side, but failed. In the original, three important actions aren't verbs, but nouns: attempt, enlisting, failure. The revision seems more direct because it expresses those actions in verbs: attempted, enlist, failed. Next, begin sentences with familiar information, new information at the end. Readers understand a sentence most readily when they grasp its subject easily, and the easiest subject to grasp is not just short and concrete, but also familiar. Compare how the second sentence in each of the following passages does or doesn't contribute to a sense of flow. New insights into global weather patterns are emerging from recent research on the large low-pressure zones rotating above the Earth's poles, known as the polar vortices. Environmental changes that are leading temperatures at the poles to rise, this research suggests, are affecting the vortices. These temperature increases cause the vortices to deviate toward the equator, bringing with them the frigid air responsible for our recent colder winters. Okay, let's check out the revision then. New insights into global weather patterns are emerging from recent research on the large pressure zones rotating above the Earth's poles, known as the polar vortices. The vortices, this research suggests, are being affected by environmental changes that are leading temperatures at the poles to rise. These temperature increases cause the vortices to deviate toward the equator, bringing with them the frigid air responsible for our recent colder winters. Most readers think the revision flows better than the original, partly because the subject of the second sentence, the vortices, is shorter than the longer subject of the original, environmental changes that are leading temperatures at the poles to rise. But the revision also flows better because the order of its ideas is different. In the original, the first words of the second sentence express new information. So, the polar vortices, environmental changes that are leading temperatures at the poles to rise. Those words about rising temperatures seem to come out of nowhere, but in the revision, the first words echo the end of the previous sentence, the polar vortices. The vortices, moreover, once we make that change, the end of that second sentence introduces the third more cohesively, leading temperatures at the poles to rise. These temperature increases contrast with the original. The end of its second sentence doesn't flow into the beginning of the third as smoothly. The vortices, these temperature increases. The corollary of the old information first principle is to put new information last, especially new technical terms. So when you introduce a new term, put it at the end of its sentence. Compare these two sentences. Calcium blockers can control muscle spasms. Sarcomeres are the small units of muscle fibers in which these drugs work. 2 filaments, one thick and one thin, are in each sarcomere. The proteins actin and myosin are contained in the thin filament. When actin and myosin interact, your heart contracts. Here's the revision. Muscle spasms can be controlled with drugs known as calcium blockers. They work in small units of muscle fibers called sarcomeres. Each sarcomere has 2 filaments, one thick and one thin. The thin filament contains 2 proteins, actin and myosin. When actin and myosin interact, your heart contracts. In the original, the new technical terms are calcium blockers, sarcomeres, filaments, the proteins actin and myosin. But they first appear early in their sentences. In contrast, in the revision, those new terms first appear towards the end of their sentences. After that, they're old information, and so can appear at the beginning of the next sentences. No principle of writing is more important than this: old before new. Familiar information introduces unfamiliar information. You may recall advice to avoid passive verbs. That is good advice when a passive verb allows you to write a sentence that contradicts the principles we have discussed, as in the second sentence of this passage. Climate change may have many catastrophic effects. Tropical diseases and destructive insect life, even north of the Canadian border, could be increased by it. The second sentence opens with an 11-word subject conveying new information, tropical diseases, Canadian border. It is the subject of a passive verb, be increased, and that verb is followed by a short, familiar bit of information from the sentence before, the concept of climate change, represented by the pronoun it. That sentence would be clearer if its verb were active. Climate change may have many catastrophic effects. It could increase tropical diseases and destructive insect life even north of the Canadian border. Now the subject is familiar, and the new information in the longer phrase is at the end. In this case, the active verb is the right choice. But if you always use active verbs, avoiding passive verbs entirely, you may write sentences that contradict the old-new principle. We saw an example of this a minute ago. The verb in the second sentence is active, but the passage flows better when it's passive. The sentence is more readable when its subject is short, concrete, and familiar, regardless of whether its verb is active or passive. So choose active or passive voice by considering which gives you the right kind of subject. Short, concrete, and familiar. Finally, use first-person pronouns appropriately. Almost everyone has heard the advice to avoid using I or we in academic writing. In fact, opinions differ on this point. Some faculty tell students never to use I because it makes their writing subjective. Others encourage them to do so in the recognition that objectivity in history is an elusive goal and that it's not just pointless but deceptive to write as if the text emerged from the topical question itself rather than a historian with a perspective. However, most faculty and editors do agree that two uses of I should be avoided. Insecure writers begin too many sentences with I think or I believe, or their equivalent in my opinion. Readers assume you think and believe what you write, so you don't have to say you do. Inexperienced writers too often narrate their research. First I consulted, then I examined, and so on. Readers care less about the story of your research than about its results. But I believe, and most editors of scholarly journals agree, that the first person is appropriate on two occasions. That sentence I just spoke illustrates one of them. I believe that the first person. An occasional introductory I, or we, believe can soften the dogmatic edge of a statement. Compare this blunter, this qualified version. But the first person is appropriate on two occasions. The trick is not to hedge so often that you sound uncertain, or so rarely that you sound smug. A first person I or we is also appropriate when it's the subject of a verb naming an action unique to you as the writer of your argument. Verbs referring to such actions typically appear in introductions. I will show, argue, prove, claim. And in conclusions, I have demonstrated, concluded that. Since only you can show, prove, or claim what's in your argument, only you can say so with I. Here's the final piece of advice. If you follow these 6 rules and make sure the first 7 to 8 words of your sentence are sound, your readers will likely find your writing clear. But you can test your writing by having someone read it back to you. If that person stumbles over a passage, you can bet your readers will struggle with it too. Once you understand how readers judge what they read, you know not only how to write clear prose, but also why so much of what you must read seems so dense. You might struggle with some writing because its content is difficult, but you may also struggle because the writer didn't write clearly. This next passage, for example, is by no means the thickest ever written. Recognition of the fact that grammars differ from one language to another can serve as the basis for serious consideration of the problems confronting translators of the great works of world literature originally written in a language other than English. But in half as many words, it means only this. Once we recognize that languages have different grammars, we can consider the problems of those who translate great works of literature into English. So, when you struggle to understand some academic writing, and you will, don't blame yourself, at least not first. Diagnose its sentences. If they have long subjects stuffed with abstract nouns expressing new information, the fault is probably not yours. Unfortunately, the more experience you get reading unclear academic prose, the greater your risk of imitating it. In fact, that risk is common to all professions, academic or not. So remain aware of it as you grow in expertise. Another bit of standard advice is choose the right words. Choose the right word with the right meaning. Affect doesn't mean effect. Illicit doesn't mean illicit. Commonly confused words are listed in many handbooks. If you're an inexperienced writer, invest in one. Choose the word with the right level of usage. If you draft quickly, you risk choosing words that might mean roughly what you think they do, but are too casual for a formal paper. Someone can criticize another writer or knock them. A risk can seem frightening or scary. Those pairs have similar meanings, but most readers would judge the second in each pair to a bit loose for an academic writing. On the other hand, if you try too hard to sound like a real academic, you risk using words that are too formal. You can think or cogitate, drink or imbibe. Those pairs are close in meaning, but the second in each is too fancy for a paper written in ordinary English. Whenever you're tempted to use a word that you think is especially fine, look for a more familiar one. The obvious advice is to look up words you're not sure of. But they're not the problem. The problem are the ones you are sure of. Worse, no dictionary tells you whether a word like visage or perambulate is too fancy for just about any context. The short-term solution is to ask someone to read your paper before you turn it in. The long-term solution is to read a lot, write a lot, endure a lot of criticism, and learn from it. Now, I ask that you click the link below to complete a practice quiz on some of the things you learned here. This is not an assessment. We merely want to see whether students enter their coursework better prepared with the completion of our video modules. Thank you for taking the time, and we look forward to seeing you in class.